Why China and Russia are so afraid of United States? For China, the US is the biggest threat, a powerful force right at its doorstep. Trying to keep up, China has teamed up with Russia, but instead of getting stronger, they have both ended up more isolated. Meanwhile, the US has allies around the world and the power to project its strength anywhere it wants. What does make Russia and China so afraid to challenge America? Starting with a closer look at their militaries, economies, and strategies, and why the US remains the world's strongest power. We will start with perhaps the most obvious difference between the three countries, their military expenditure and budget. According to most recent statistics, the US military budget for 2023 was around $916 billion, around 3.5% of its GDP. Compare that to the Chinese, which had a 2023 budget for roughly $296 billion. This means that the US is spending three times more on its national defense system than China. In fact, the US military spending is close to 40% of worldwide national defense budgets, with China in second place with 13% of global spending. In 2021, military budget for Russia was around $66 billion. In recent years, this has practically doubled. The increase in Russia's budget could be explained by Russia funneling significantly more resources into the Ukraine war. This means that Russia was funneling money into its military at the expense of other sectors, which could have lasting consequences for the country's economy. And even then, the country could barely scrap a portion of what the US or even China spent on their militaries. But let's put the budget in a more historical perspective. Between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and 2021, the United States spent $19 trillion on national defense. This spending is $16 trillion more than what China spent. The stark difference between the US spending and China's signifies how much of a head start the US has actually had on the military stage for the past 30 or even 60 years. Let's look at some of the key examples of military power projection. United States has the biggest fleet of the fighter aircrafts in the world, mostly 5th generation like F-35 and F-22, while China started the 21st century with mostly 2nd generation aircraft from the Soviet Union, and it has replaced them with the 3rd generation and 4th generation equivalents, namely the Chengdu J-10 by 2017. As a result, the Chinese fighter airplane technology is about 15 to 20 years behind that of the US. More important is the fact that US Air Force projects its military power alarmingly close to the Chinese borders. This is due to the US maintaining over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries worldwide. The US military stations over 50,000 troops in Japan, which maintains direct control over vital islands in the East China Sea. Additionally, US military bases are scattered around the South China Sea, namely close to the Strait of Malacca. The strait is a point of contention for the Chinese economy, as most of its naval trade with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa has to pass there. The US Air Force and Navy have basically projected their power directly against the Chinese claims in those two seas. This is mainly to create a separation between the mainland China and Taiwan, a country that China has set its eyes on ever since their separation. The US Air Force, with its better stealth technology and a larger arsenal of fighters and multi-role aircrafts, can effectively enforce air superiority over the Chinese waters. The air superiority would lessen as the conflict approaches or goes into the Chinese mainland. The US stealth bomber technology, particularly in the B-1B model and B-2 models, is particularly unparalleled in the modern world. This is further enhanced by the US possessing perhaps the most advanced piercing bombs, such as the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators or MOPs, a 3,000-pound bomb that can punch through as much as 60 feet of reinforced concrete. Modern estimates suggest that both USA and Russia kept around 1,700 nuclear missiles in active deployment and around 2,000 to 4,000 nuclear warheads in storage. China, on the other hand, has only about 400 nuclear warheads, with approximately 24 deployed on intercontinental missiles. Remember, the US still has the capacity to launch conventional strikes that could disable Russian nuclear launch sites. The reverse is unlikely to happen since the US has stored its warhead much deeper inland and Russia doesn't have comparable stealth capacities. Its only solution would be intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would likely be detected 10 minutes after firing. Furthermore, with Russia's military progress waning, the war in Ukraine has practically reversed the country's ability to project geopolitical and military influence outward. The scale of the Western sanctions that started in 2022 has caused Russia to rely economically on China, to the extent that it was estimated that China accounted for more than a third of Russian exports. This means that Russia will likely need to follow China's lead, which is nowhere near the nuclear capability or defensive capacity of the US. Even beyond the US Air Force presence, the US Navy is still likely years ahead of Chinese as well. Most notable is the fact that the US has 11 aircraft carriers while China has only 2. This allows the US Navy and Air Force to mount devastating attacks closer to China's waters.